I am truly honored to be a part of this event and sit virtually among so many leaders and brilliant minds. First, one bit of housekeeping. There will be an opportunity for questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A button on the left-hand side of your screen to submit your questions to the speakers, and keep in mind that this function is only available to registered participants. And I will remind you again as our session gets underway of how to do that. Our session is entitled Keeping Peace, Contributing to Stability Beyond NATO's Borders. We're here to discuss the role of NATO members in working for stability beyond the borders of the NATO alliance. One goal of NATO, as the audience all knows, is to resolve differences through negotiations and political dialogue rather than armed conflict in order to preserve peace. And that has meant that often, particularly in the last 2 decades, NATO has had to focus outside of its borders. The 21st century has brought world events that have taken members outside the borders of the alliance for the fight against the Taliban in Afghanistan, the fight against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and Russia's increasingly aggressive behavior, including the annexation of Crimea. And for decades, members of the alliance have been working with NATO partners in the Middle East and in North Africa. The questions today are, have their efforts been successful? Do members need to focus more or less on what is going on outside the borders of the alliance? And keep in mind here that NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has said, when our neighbors are stable, we are more secure. So we begin our discussion today in Yemen. And as most of you know, democratic rights in Yemen are severely restricted. We have a video statement today from Tawakkol Karman. She is the chairwoman and co-founder of Women Journalists Without Chains. It's an organization that promotes freedom of expression and democratic rights. She's also a 2011 Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Here's Tawakkol Karman.
Hello everyone. I hope you are all in good health and spirit. I am happy to be with you at the first NATO Youth Summit. As you see, our world is going through a state of global disorder and conflicts, with decreasing commitment to dialogue and coordination between countries. The escalation of wars and conflict during last years is a reflection of the global failure to respond to the demands of people for freedom, democracy, justice, and rule of law, especially people in Arab Spring countries. The global disorder seems to be reviving old conflicts, which threatens global peace, like what is happening now between Azerbaijan and Armenia, between Greece and Turkey. The global disorder is also evident in Syria, for example, where all the contradictions have converged on confronting the Syrians' dream for freedom and democracy. Iran and Saudi Arabia have been leading counter-revolutions, igniting wars, and supporting militias and extremist groups in countries in Arab region that have witnessed popular uprising calling for democracy. In my country, Yemen, there is a war that has been going on for about 6 years. This war has been led by regional parties, namely Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran. Their counter-revolution effort that aim to kill people's dream of creating a new, democratic, stable, united Yemen. This war has led Yemen to be the worst and to suffer from the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, according to the UN. This tragedy continues with the absence of serious effort from the international community to stop this devastating war. Here we should call NATO to work very hard and immediately to stop these conflicts and wars around the world, to build peace around the world. Peace building, as we all know, requires attention to the political, cultural, economic, and social elements. For me, the first element that must be ensured for the success of any peace initiative is to impose severe sanctions on warlords and restrictions on those finding their interests in the continuation of armed conflict. I call on NATO to build a peace strategy. A peace strategy that includes supporting the demands of people for democracy and for freedom, and refraining from cooperating with the authoritarian regimes. NATO should be with people to combat despotism and terrorism together. This should be our global partnership. Those who align with the tyrannies under any form not only jeopardize values but also undermine their country's strategic interests and undermine global peace. Finally, to you, the youth of this very important NATO summit. This new century needs new creative generations and new energy like yours. You are today's world hope. You should be today's world leaders. Everything you do, no matter how small or big, will have an impact. Keep up the good fight for a good and noble values. Believe in yourselves and do the right thing. This world is yours. Go out there and make the world a better and safe place. Make the world free from tyranny and terrorism. Make the world free from poverty, hunger, and corruption. And make the world free from hatred and racism. No one can do that but you. I trust you. Thank you so much.
Well, that was terrific. Thank you, Tawakkol Karman. I think it's very clear after hearing that inspirational message to the youth leaders of this NATO summit, it's very clear why the world and Yemen knows her as the Iron Woman. I'd like to bring in our panelists now. We have first Dr. Frances Brown, who is a senior fellow in the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. She has also worked at the White House on the National Security Council staff. We have Major General Jenny Carignan of the Canadian Armed Forces, who is the commander of NATO Mission Iraq in Baghdad, which of course is the non-combat advisory and training mission that works primarily with the Iraqi Ministry of Defense and helps build Iraqi institutions, including and strengthening the Iraqi military. And we have Maryam Safi, who is the founder and director of the Organization for Policy Research and Development Studies in Kabul, which elevates women's voices and perspectives to local policymakers and to the international community. Welcome to you all. Dr. Brown, I'd like to start with you. You've written about the need for stabilization in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and beyond. NATO nations have been involved in stabilization and in countering terrorism for years, more than 2 decades now, particularly in Afghanistan and now in Iraq and in Syria. What have the allies, the NATO allies, learned? And will it make it, what they have learned over these 2 decades, do you think that that will make it more or less likely that NATO nations will get involved in conflict areas in the future? Dr. Brown, if you can hear me, I think you might be muted. I'm sorry to interrupt. If you can hear me, I think you might be muted.
I'm so sorry. Is that better?
There we go.
Lessons relearned in NATO and on Zoom are that you should always unmute. So a few thoughts on lessons NATO allies have learned over the past, I'd say, 2 decades. Number one is the importance of connecting large national level politics to local level stabilization efforts. I would say in both Iraq and Afghanistan, we started with a focus on the national level, on Baghdad and Kabul. Then we realized somewhat belatedly the importance of focusing at the local level on stabilization and violent extremism reduction there, pivoted in both cases towards the local level. But then still never really successfully linked up those two efforts. So now, many years onwards in Afghanistan, the NATO mission there has sort of turned back to a much more modest footprint, much more national level focus. But we still haven't successfully linked up all the progress that was made on the local level with those national level efforts. So I think that's number one. Number two lesson I think we've learned over and over again is that we can make progress on the security side, on the military side, much more quickly than we can on the governance side. And when we think about stabilization agenda for NATO going forward, it really is about linking those two efforts together. You may recall the era of clear, hold, build in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, it's always much more quick to clear an area than to link it up with holding and building. So we've learned that going forward. And then the third lesson, just on a very fundamental level, is I think we've learned over and over how hard it is to connect civilian lines of efforts with the military advising, assisting efforts. And although I think all NATO allies sort of work in good faith to connect those up, I think in practice it's often very hard for some bureaucratic reasons. I'll leave it there for now.
Great. I want to follow up on that and stay in Afghanistan for a moment. Ms. Safi, I'd like to ask you about the fight for women's and girls' rights in Afghanistan, something that you have been very outspoken and you're working towards. How can NATO help ensure that women's rights are preserved in a power-sharing agreement with the Afghan government and the Taliban? Is there a role for NATO? Can they actually influence the issue enough that it's not ignored in the inter-Afghan dialogues?
Thank you, Ms. Cube. Great pleasure to be here with you all. I think NATO has great leverage on the negotiating parties in the table. And one of the key leverage is that in the agreement between the United States and the Taliban on a withdrawal of forces, which also includes withdrawal and reduction of NATO forces, there's a key component there that can be stressed upon, and that is to align the withdrawal of forces from Afghanistan to key deliverables and conditionalities on the ground. That means it comes to the assurances of maintaining the constitutional rights of Afghan women and the gains that they have made in the last 19 years. Those gains can be now linked to the timeline of withdrawal. So as a condition is met on the ground that secures these interests, then withdrawal can be slowly phased out. And that's a key leverage that the international community holds down.
I'd like to ask, and I just want to update our audience, we're still working to get General Karman on the phone. We're having a little bit of connection issues. Not surprising given she's calling in from Baghdad. But I would like to ask a question to the both of you, if I can. We'll start with you, Dr. Brown. Does NATO need to do more to protect civilians in these conflict zones? One area that comes to mind is in northern Syria, where we have this refugee crisis. But beyond just that, should NATO play a larger role in the protection of civilians in conflict areas? And how do you see, if so, how do you see that playing out in various areas? Dr. Brown?
Yeah, to my mind, it's essential that NATO play that role. I'm certainly aware there's many organizational considerations that determine a NATO mission in any given country, but I think when we think about a durable stability, which is what this panel is all about, sort of not just winning the immediate term conflict, but ensuring stability in the long run, ensuring the conditions that don't foment violent extremism in the longer term. I think NATO playing a civilian protection role is key. I do think NATO and specific allied countries have recognized this in recent engagements. And I think there was a lot of thought given to whether specific operations would, quote, create more bad guys than they took off the battlefield. So I think there's been effort in this direction, but I think honestly, in a wartime context, it's often very hard to execute that in real life. But to my mind, this comes back to linking up the civilian lines of efforts with the military ones. And when we think about an enduring battlefield success, really thinking about those civilian considerations on as equal importance to the military operational planning that we do every day.
Ms. Safi?
Yes, I would absolutely concur with Ms. Brown on that. One of the difficulties we faced in Afghanistan with the involvement of NATO was, on the one hand, as we saw the rise in the insurgency, the emergence of the insurgency towards the very initial stages of the international intervention, two things led to that rise. One was the lack of focus on the development front and the securitization of NATO's involvement predominantly under security sector reform, lacking that development stage on the one hand, and on the other hand, the sort of quasi-state building counterinsurgency efforts, which really wreaked havoc on the populations at the subnational level, and it really gave rise to civilian casualties. And as civilian casualties increased, that eroded the legitimacy that NATO intended to develop with other partners between the population and the state, the new state, I must say at that time, and also between the population and the efforts of the international community. So ensuring the protection of civilians, especially in the counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan, was something that was very severely overlooked for a very long time, and it disenfranchised the local population.
I want to remind the audience again that there's a Q&A button on the left-hand side of your screen to submit questions. We have a couple that have come in. One comes from Daniel in Poland, and he asks, dear panelists, don't you think that tougher USA policies towards Saudi Arabia's actions in the Middle East would bring more stability and peace to the region? Of course, that touches on what we heard from Ms. Karman in her recorded statement about the actions of Saudi Arabia in the region, particularly in Yemen. Dr. Brown and Ms. Safi, I'm curious about your feelings on that. Does the USA need a tougher policy towards Saudi Arabia and their actions in the region?
I can start. In my view, yes. I think when we think about the conflict in Yemen, a key driver of that, a key driver of the casualties does stem from arms. And so I think thinking very clearly about what NATO allied members are doing to exacerbate conflict is super important. And I suspect, not being able to see the future, but I suspect we'll see a reconsideration of that policy now that Vice President Biden has become President-elect Biden. So I would expect there will be some really sober looks at what U.S. policy towards Saudi Arabia is affecting in Yemen.
Ms. Safi?
Ms. Cube, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear your question.
Oh, I'll read it again. It's a question from Daniel in Poland, and he's asking whether a tougher USA policy towards Saudi Arabia's actions in the Middle East would bring more stability to the region. Do you think so? Do you agree with that?
Well, I would say that now with President-elect Joe Biden, perhaps we may see a shift in policy. And I think that this shift in strengthening or toughening its policies could try to bring about a balance amongst the efforts of all the stakeholders in the region. So I would say that this could potentially hold a stability factor, but we will wait and see how that policy transforms.
I think here in the US, we're waiting to see how a lot of policies transform in the next administration. We have another question from Sophie in Germany, who asks, if you think about engaging with civil society on the ground, how do you think NATO should reform the protection and inclusion of young people and children? So we've already spoken about women, specifically women and girls, but what about protections for young people and children? Dr. Brown, could you address that? And Ms. Safi, perhaps you could address it specifically to Afghanistan.
Sure, I can start. So I agree with the premise of the question. It's essential. I can't speak to NATO level guidance on inclusion of youth because I'm not deeply in the weeds on it. But I will say when it comes to the United States and its own measures it takes to include youth, I would say that there have been many disparate efforts on this in various conflict areas. I think the challenge is really going beyond one-time engagement with youth, sort of having a youth meeting, having a youth shura, and actually connecting those engagements to the bigger level politics of the area. So on the US effort in Afghanistan, and I'm interested in Ms. Safi's views on this as well, I think over the course of the so-called surge, so around 2009 to 2013, we did see a lot of efforts to bring in youth on a sort of one-off basis. The problem is that those one-off meetings rarely led to a bigger policy shift from the US. And now I think this is essential as we think about any potential peace bargain in Afghanistan. There is a very robust youth movement in Afghanistan, very diverse. I think bringing in those voices in a really substantive way, rather than just a tokenistic way, will be important going forward. In my view, it's essential. It's helpful when we bring these efforts into the central bargain, the central negotiations. Don't just have a separate meeting on youth, but actually bring them to the table on sort of on the larger conversations. But I'm really curious Ms. Safi's views on these.
Thank you. I would add to that and state that in failed and post-conflict states, security sector models have to be very careful, not be merely looked as being imposed by external actors, which to a large extent in the very beginning of NATO's intervention in Afghanistan, this is largely what it was and how it was being looked at. However, later on, in the realization that they were losing the hearts and minds of the local population, more commitment was placed to ensure that all sectors, I would say civil society, women, and youth, were engaged more. And I think that NATO so far in Afghanistan has, and platforms that I've been a part of, have created forums where they engage more frequently with different sectors of civil society, particularly with women's groups. However, these meetings are not as consistent or as institutionalized as they should be to ensure that what is being discussed or the voices that are being shared are then actually taken to influence decision makers and policymakers. In that area, there is a lot more work that needs to be done. And I would say even more with youth. I agree with Ms. Brown, we have quite a vibrant youth population. 64% population is below the age of 24. So engaging youth across the country is quite important. That engagement is taking place, but right now it's predominantly at in the city centers and not so much at subnational level. And this is actually instead of coming together. So a lot more efforts needs to be placed there. A lot more platforms need to be created. But more than that, we need to ensure that voices are actually heard and then influenced at a level where that is missing in Afghanistan. And in the recent few years, I would say perhaps in the last 2 to 3 years, I have seen that NATO has actually started to distance its engagement from both civil society organizations and youth, and to an extent even women's group. So that needs to be re-engaged.
And it's an ongoing battle, truly battle there in Afghanistan. I mean, just only several days ago, there was the horrific attack at Kabul University that killed students and professors. The Taliban is, and you know, insurgents are fighting against the youth population there and against their education. So it is something that is as important as ever for NATO to engage in. I'd love to bring that in. We've only got a few minutes left, but this is the NATO Youth Summit. This is about the future leaders of NATO and a decade out. How do you see? Let's touch particularly on NATO working with civil society. What advice do you have, or how do you see NATO working with civil society going forward, and particularly where do you see it in 2030? How can NATO be successful with its goals with more engagement with the civil society? Dr. Brown?
There's a couple priorities in my mind. Number one is NATO in 2030, when it thinks about civil society engagement or just efficacy in general, I think it has to really retool for smaller footprint operations. So we probably won't see another NATO mission Afghanistan of that scope, but we will see, I think, many smaller scale operations. So retooling its civil society engagement and indeed its planning in general for those smaller footprint operations. The second thing I think NATO future leaders need to think about is how do we measure progress and define success in stabilization operations? We've done so much over the last 20 years of improving monitoring and evaluation on the ground, but we still can't really answer this fundamental question, which is it working or not? Are we winning or not? And I do think civil society engagement is both part of the answer to how do we know where it's working, and also part of the objective is empowering civil society to have a vibrant role in the host nation government. And then my final thought on this is that I think NATO allies in general still have very distinct ideas of what we're talking about when we talk about stabilization overall. We in the United States government just came up with a common definition of stabilization within the United States government. And then there's many different nuances when you talk with other NATO allies. So I think when we think about succeeding in the NATO of 2030, I think it behooves all NATO young leaders to think about what is our common definition of success and what we're trying to do when we do stabilization.